Hello, everybody. This is Rob Fredette with the podcast HODGEPOD. I have another special guest on my show today, and I can't believe it's my 100th episode. I cannot believe it. I didn't even think I'd hit 100. It's been quite a journey. I'm looking forward to 2025. I have some great episodes that I'm going to line up for 2025. But my audience is here today, and they're really happy that I did hit that 100 episode mark. And they've been gracious enough to stick around. And they're really rambunctious, and they're going crazy. I'm going to have to settle them down. It's a Saturday, but thanks so much, guys. I really appreciate the effort there. So thank you so much. But let's get on to the podcast. Larry Kemp is my guest. He is the host of Nobody Knows Your Story. And I was a guest on his podcast last month in November. And it's a great podcast, and I'll let him tell you about the podcast. But after it, I did a little bit of reflecting, which I'll talk about. And Larry Kemp, welcome to HODGEPOD. I'm really honored that you're here.
Hey, Rob, thanks for having me on. We have a lot in common. So this is kind of an easy thing for me. I mean,
yeah.
I didn't do any prep or anything. I mean, you talked about my podcast. It's simply just people coming on and telling their life story. And that's what you did. And it was fun. It was fun hearing your story and seeing how much we had in common. So yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. And what I like about your podcast is I guess it's just people like you. We don't know the story, average, everyday people. And I like learning about people have peaks and valleys, and they have tragedy, or they have obstacles in their life. And actually you could pick up and learn something from that. And the episodes that I've heard, it's like everybody, we're all on the same boat.
Yes, for sure. And I should say it has a little bit of a Hawaiian theme too, because that was a big part of my life story. And so I try to put in a couple of Hawaiian songs each time, because I feel like I'm paying it forward by introducing these Hawaiian artists and Polynesian artists. Sometimes they're not always from Hawaii, but to people around the world. The podcast is in 45 countries. So these folks are very, very well known in the islands, but you get outside of the islands, or maybe the Polynesian community on the West Coast, and a lot of people don't know who Henry Kapono is, or, any of the people that I have had on. I've actually had 3 or 4 pretty famous Hawaiian artists on my podcast and been able to share even more of their music. So yeah, it's a fun part for me too.
I was watching the Maui Classic a couple of weeks ago, and the games were on in the afternoon here, and it was like morning time there. And it looks like they're playing in an absolute high school gym, these major college programs, and they always had these outtakes that go into commercials or coming in from a commercial. And just some of the scenery in Hawaii is just spectacular. Talk about Hawaii, if you would, because it is a destination for many to vacation.
Hawaii is a place for me that was always calling to me as a young man growing up in Southern California. And I lived in a time way back when, these game shows, the prize would be a trip to Hawaii many times. And I remember telling my grandmother, someday I'm going there. And she would like pat my head and go, yeah. She'd never even been on an airplane. So the thought of going to Hawaii or maybe even living there was like just a dream to her. But I just was infatuated with it. I lived, like I say, in Southern California, beach communities like Laguna Beach, San Diego. So we would go to the ocean, go to the beach. But the water's kind of cold. I mean, you get in, you do your best, you kind of get used to it. But I just always had heard about the tropical waters of Hawaii, and they were warmer. And of course, you see the palm trees and the pretty hula girls. And I mean, why wouldn't you want to visit that place? And so, yeah, that's how I gained an interest in Hawaii.
And I know when you were on my podcast last, I believe we spoke, you have been to Pearl Harbor. Talk about Pearl Harbor, if you would, because it's quite a memorial for those who died on December 7th, 1941. But what is it like at Pearl Harbor? It's quite a memorial, is it not?
It really is. And they've done a lot over the years to improve it as for the visitors. When I first went in 1975, you actually took a little boat and kind of went out to it. And, you were able to get off onto this kind of makeshift, I don't even know what to call it, but it wasn't really a stage, but you could walk and look down, and we were above like the USS Arizona, and you could see oil still coming up from the ship. It would be on the surface of the water and kind of, rainbowy oils that you see on oil on water. But it was just amazing to me to think that that's been coming up for all those years. Now that was 1975. Now when you go, they put you you go to an auditorium and you actually watch a film first, and it has some footage of that battle that day and some history. And it kind of gives you even a better feel for just what went on that day. And so I like the way they're doing it now, much more than when I first went in 1975. But at the end of the day, when you're sitting there thinking about it and thinking about all that lost their lives, yeah, it hits you pretty hard. It really does, especially if you're patriotic and you love our country. And I just am so grateful that for the, all these men and women who gave their lives to, give us the freedoms that we have.
I would love to go to Hawaii someday, and that is one place I would love to go pay my respects. But when you look back at like history, you have Pearl Harbor and Normandy. Those are two sacred places there. It really hits home. And one day I'd like to get to Normandy as well. But it's amazing the sacrifice that happened back at that time in our history.
It really is. And I consider myself fortunate that I have lived my life, at least during the times when I was eligible, I guess, to go to combat. There was really no wars going on. So it's pretty fortunate. And I have two sons, and neither one of them, there wasn't a draft. So they didn't get drafted or needed to go. We have a lot of military in our family. My wife's father was in the Army. He retired after 20 years as a major. My son-in-law right now is about 9 years into his career in the Coast Guard. He's a lieutenant in the Coast Guard. My father was in the Air Force. My son was in the Air Force. But yeah, I was able to just appreciate all that, these people do from afar. And I'm just grateful that I did not have to be called upon to defend our country. If I was called upon, I would have done it, but I'm glad I didn't have to.
Yeah. My father was in the Army in the late 50s. He was not in combat. He did 4 years of service and then got the GI Bill, but his father was a veteran of the Navy in World War I. And he was on a ship in World War I. And then when World War II happened, he was 52 years old. He was part of the Coast Guard Reserve in World War II because everybody stepped up during that time. And when you look back, the people who actually were veterans in World War I, like my grandfather, they actually worked as reserves. Everybody was patriotic and was behind the movement with World War II.
Well, I think that, it's funny because sometimes you'll get with your friends and people are like, well, people don't seem to be as patriotic as they were, 20, 30 years ago. And I said, it cycles. It really does. And sometimes when there's something like if you think back to when was the last time the country was really unified and patriotic? Well, it was when 9/11 happened because we were just all unified in this tragedy that happened. It just shocked us all so much. And we were everybody was on the same page, and it doesn't really matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, you just kind of pulled together. And, it's sad that a tragedy or something like that has to kind of be the Kickstarter to get it going like that. But I know many people would like to see us kind of put our differences aside, or at least figure out a way to work together so that we can be kind of have that patriotic feel that we've had at those times. Like you said, during the war, people just stepped up. They did what they had to do. A lot of women went into factories. You hear that Rosie the Riveter and that kind of stuff. And people did what they had to do. A lot of people did without. I mean, they couldn't have maybe some of the medals because they needed those for, airplanes and different things. Yeah.
I remember Desert Storm in the early 90s. It was putting your headlights on in support of the troops in Desert Storm. So it's quite extraordinary when a country gets together and is patriotic. One of your podcast episodes that I was really riveted to was when you talked to gold medal wrestler Rulon Gardner, and that was an amazing episode. And talk about that episode. I was just riveted when I was listening to it. Just the fact that he beat this indestructible force from Russia or the Soviet Union. Talk about that, because I found that to be very inspirational.
That he's a great guy, and he lives in the community here where I live, and we didn't even know that when I was reaching out to him. It's so funny. But I mentioned on the podcast that and of course, if you listen to that podcast, he gives all his background story of growing up in Wyoming and in small town of Afton. But he overcame a lot of obstacles. He really did. He had trouble in school. He just had an older brother that was about a year older that every time they wrestled, he couldn't beat this older brother until finally he was in high school, like a junior, and he finally beat him. And even then the coach said, well, this is your brother's senior year. So, I'm going to need you to kind of take a step back and let him do his thing, which he did. But so he gets into all that, how he kind of prepared himself. And then overcame a lot of odds to make the Olympic team. And then who does he end up going to wrestle for the gold? And this is the part that's so funny. If you listen to the story, he says they announced before his match with Alexander, what was his last name? It's kind of funny now.
We know he's a Russian, so we get it.
Yeah. So I can't remember his last name. I think it's Corella. Mm-hmm. But so he was going to wrestle this guy, and they had a announcement of a party to signify his fourth gold medal, because this guy hadn't been beaten in like 13 years. He was a 3-time Olympic gold medalist. And so they already announced the party for later that night before the match with Rulon. And so Rulon felt like, I don't have anything to lose. Everybody's already thinking I'm not going to win anyway. And he beat this guy. And the thing that was great was I was watching this in Lahaina, Maui, in Moose McGillicuddy's with some friends. And we were just going crazy when he beat that guy. Yeah, it was just so wild. So just a great story. And he has several great stories because he's had some interesting brushes with death that he, a lot of people wouldn't have survived, and he did. So he really has a very interesting story. You're right.
What about the fact that he beat them? What was what did you feel like his reaction was when he beat him? It's amazing that, they thought the Russian was going to win, and he wins, and he's forever immortalized for winning the gold medal. That is just an unbelievable story. I would equate that with the 1980 USA Olympic hockey team in some respect.
Well, and that's true, because they called that the miracle on the ice. And if you listen to the announcers, because I listened to his match, and the announcers, one guy says, what would it be if Gardner, the American, was to beat the Russian? And the guy says, well, if the hockey win in 1980 was the miracle on the ice, then this would certainly be the miracle on the mat. And that's exactly what happened, because he did beat him. It was a miracle to many. And the thing that he says when he thinks back on why he won, he says that in months before this match, as they prepared, they would do this thing where one wrestler would go out into the middle of the ring, and then there'd be like 10 other wrestlers, and each guy would go in for 2 minutes and wrestle hard. And so that was 20 minutes of just getting 10 different guys coming at you. And he just felt like his endurance was more than the Russians. And that towards the end of the match, he could just sense the Russian losing power. Just his stamina. It was going away. And he just knew I just basically had more stamina. I just still had more gas in my tank at the end. And that's what it took.
And he has massive strength just by the size of him. That's like he was matching strength with strength. When you speak about the 1980 USA Olympic hockey team, here was a bunch of college players going against the Soviets, who were like the best team in the world for many years, especially in the 70s when they were beating NHL teams. That's quite an achievement, too. I still think that is the greatest hockey achievement in the 20th century. Nothing tops that. I don't care whatever that sports moment is, that sports moment when they beat the Soviets. I still remember to this day watching it, and that game was just amazing. Do you have any recollections of that?
Yeah, I remember that. And I was just thinking as you were saying that, just different Olympic moments, because I was into the Olympics growing up. I watched a lot of the races, especially the track and field that went on. And I think I told you that I got my degree in sports broadcasting. So in 1982, I got hired by ABC just to mostly be a gopher, but I worked with Jim Lampley, and I was down on they had the NCAA track and field championships in Provo, where I just was wrapping up going to school. And so I was just down on the field, and all I was supposed to do was I was covering the javelin and the shot put. And so if somebody bested what the mark was, then I was just supposed to let them know. But anyway, but just kind of fun being part. I remember that was back when I think it was it Stanley Floyd? Was that his name? And Houston McTeer and some of these different runners. Carl Lewis's sister, I remember, was running in that one too. So just to be around these athletes, though, and just see them up close, and it's like, man, these people are in shape. I mean, it was just, they're very different than the rest of us, that's for sure.
Yeah, the training that they put in, that must have been cool working with Jim Lampley. He's a immortal, legendary broadcaster. I remember him growing up watching ABC. That must bring back great memories.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I'll mention these names and I always want to say, hey, these people wouldn't know me from Adam. I mean, because I was just, you know what I mean? I've met so many people over the years because I've just had the opportunity I mentioned to you that I worked the fights in Vegas for 10 years and I met so many people. I've shook hands with Muhammad Ali. I've met a couple times. I've actually run into George Foreman. I mean, so I've just had some real opportunities to meet a lot of famous people. But if you were to ask him, you remember Larry Kent? They'd be like, Larry who? So I don't want to be one of those name dropper types, that there's nothing there. I just happen to run into these people. And like Lampley, yeah, he wouldn't remember me. I was just one of several people that was feeding him information.
So I got a story back in 1989. I was working as a producer on a sports talk show called The Sports Huddles. And I was also doing sports on the radio, another station in Massachusetts. And on a Sunday night, Eddie Endelman, who was the host of the Sports Huddle, he was the host with Mark Wicken and Jim McCarthy. And I still remember, it was the beginning of October 1989. And he asked me on Sunday, he goes, I need you to do me a favor. I said, yeah, what do you need me to do? He says, I need you to pick up Kevin McHale at the airport. I said, sure, I'll go pick him up with my car. So he goes, no, you're not going to go in your car. You're going to go in a limousine. You're going to meet him at the airport. I go, what? I said, okay, so no worries. So I get to the airport. This is when you could go walk down to the gates and you didn't have to go through all that. So I'm waiting for the plane to land from Philadelphia and the plane was late. So I had to get on the phone. There were no cell phones in 1989. I had to get on the payphone and call the producers at Channel 56. The plane's a little bit late, so we're going to get there late. And then all of a sudden the plane lands and I see Kevin McHale walking off the plane. I go, hey, Kevin, I'm Rob Fredette. I'm here to pick you up for a Channel 56 show. It was Cam Neely, Kevin McHale, Andre Tippett, and Roger Clemens on the show. It was one player from each of the Boston teams. And he could not have been nicer in the limousine. I was like, we didn't even talk basketball. We talked, rock and roll and things like that, but he could not have been nicer. But I remember seeing him walking off the plane. I go, how am I going to talk to him or introduce myself to him? It was again, it's like an out-of-body experience, but it was pretty cool. And it was really awesome. I guess he was at a golf tournament with Charles Barkley, but I have that memory. These people wouldn't even know who I am if I bumped into him, but it just like a half hour of my life was with Kevin McHale. He could not have been nicer. So every time I see him on TV, I always think about that.
It's fun when you meet people, especially people that you admire, and you find that they're actually genuinely good people.
Yeah.
And that's most of the time that's been the case. I've had a couple people that were, let's face it, they were assholes, but I mean, that's few. Most of them were really good people. And when I was working the fights, one time the supervisor comes up to me and goes, hey, Larry, I need you to sit with, he goes, this is Mr. Barkley here. I turn around, it was Charles Barkley, and Charles shakes my hand and he goes, I just need you to kind of sit with him and keep people away so he can enjoy this fight tonight. So for an hour and a half, I just sat with Barkley and we talked and laughed and shared stories. And after the fight was over, he goes, hey, Larry, can you walk me out through the casino? We weren't supposed to do that. And I go, sure, I'll do it. And he was playing for the Phoenix Suns. This is 1993. I think that was the year he was the MVP.
That's right.
But he goes, do you ever come to the Suns games? Because I told him I lived in Phoenix and I was just up there for the fight. But I said, no, I can't get a ticket. They're always sold out. And he goes, all right. So he goes, let me get a pen here. And he writes down this name and he goes, all right, you call this guy and tell him I said to hook you up. And so I did. And my wife and I sat right next to Barkley's wife and in these wonderful seats and watched the Suns play. But talk about a great experience. But still, if you were to say to him, you remember Larry Camp? I'm sure he'd say, no. Because I just meet so many people,
Yeah, I got another story about that show, and it was Roger Clemens was a guest on the show. This was in 88 or 89, if I remember correctly, and he came on, the Sunday show was on from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. on Sunday night. It was like top-notch sports talk show in Boston. So Roger Clemens comes in, and there was another adjacent radio station, WBOS, that was next door, and husband of somebody who worked at the station brought some baseball cards in from Roger Clemens, and he gave me one. And after the show, he kindly signed the autographs. And it was like that time when they started charging for autographs, and somebody asked him, "Are you going to charge for the autographs?" He goes, "No, I'm not going to charge you guys." I have that memory too. I got it in a nice glass case. It's not authenticated, but it's an actual. He actually signed it, so it's pretty cool. Like when you see stuff like that, like you did. Like what people don't see behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's true. And like I say, I've just because of different things. I just met a lot of people. I had a conversation with Oprah Winfrey one time, and just the two of us. There was nobody around, and I just asked to chat with her for a minute, and she listened. This was in Maui, and she has a home on Maui, and just super nice. And so the funny thing is when you've had that experience, then you are a fan of these people forever. And I can't tell you how many people I have mentioned to that I've run into Oprah, or I did this or that, and they were just really good people. So if I ever hear somebody badmouthing one of these people, I'm like, well, I can tell you personal experience, and they were very nice. So that's the other part. No matter what anybody says about Roger Clemens, oh, he was on steroids, oh, blah, blah, you're going to remember back to what a nice guy he was.
Oh, he was.
The time that you ran into him. And that's what I'm talking about. You have that personal feeling, and that's going to take precedent over what somebody's going to write in an article or something.
And Sean McDonough used to be a guest on the show from time to time. He was there a couple of times, the ESPN broadcaster. He's been broadcasting now for 30 plus years. And he's one of the nicest people. He could not have been nicer when he was behind the scenes before he went on the show and after he left. Really great guy. When I see him on TV, I always think about when he came to the show. It's just like you said, 10 minutes of your life with somebody like that goes a long way when people are nice. So that's an excellent story about you and yours as well. But when I was on your guest last month, I was on my first day of my vacation. So I talked about my parents and growing up. And I had a lot of reflection after that because I looked at photo albums that week. I was on vacation. I had looked at some photo albums. And when you look back at time of your life, you reflect. It's amazing, isn't it?
Oh, it is. Yeah. And everybody knows me as the guy that takes a lot of pictures and I think I mentioned that I had a son pass away in 2018. Mm-hmm. And when that happens, all you have left really are your memories. And I'm so grateful that I had hundreds of pictures of my son. And so now every time I go anywhere, I take pictures, and because I like having those things, and then I'll make them into photo books. Oh, here's a photo book of our cruises. Here's a photo book of softball. Here's a photo book of hikes, whatever we do. Yeah. I just like to have those pictures. So yeah, when you reflect back, especially as we get older, my parents are gone. My wife's parents are gone now. I had a brother who passed away. Yeah. The pictures, the memories, that's all we have. And if you're lucky enough to maybe even have some videos, because I grew up at a time when they had my dad had the old, Super 8 cameras or whatever. And so we'll take some of those now, and you can put them on to DVDs or whatever. We've done that with a lot of the old slides that my dad used to take back in the day because they didn't have the cameras like we do now. Now we have them on our phones. So it makes it pretty easy.
And when my wife and I, we moved into our house here back in 2000, and my parents were retiring down here. So my father stayed with us for about 4 or 5 days. So he was looking for a house and all that good stuff. And he stayed at our house. And when I was looking through the photo albums, there were some pictures that I had totally forgotten about, but we took pictures, and I took pictures of him here at the house. So I've told my wife I want to get pictures where he stood from the same exact angle around the house. So I want to match him up. When you look back though, like the memory is there. He's like, God, he stood there, and it was like, or he was in the house. And 3 years ago, my mother moved out of her house, she had an estate sale, and we ended up keeping the kitchen table from the kitchen. So I'm glad we did, because we had many meals there. So it's always a great remembrance when you have things that you remember your parents or loved ones by.
Well, that's the whole thing with the pictures is you see a picture and it just takes you back to the event. It could be a picture from high school. It could be a picture from playing sports, or it could be a picture from your wedding day or for a funeral or whatever it is, but it takes you back to the occasion. And that's one of the reasons I really like pictures. It just helps me remember things that maybe I would have forgotten.
Exactly. And when I look back, when I was a young one, when I was a kid, when we used to, in our little league uniforms or in our youth hockey uniforms, and the sacrifices that parents make, and you look back and it's like, it's so refreshing to know that what they did. So I think it's pretty awesome. I'm sure you did done a lot of things for your children as well. So that's such a great testimony to when we grow up. So.
Yeah, for sure.
I was looking the other day with all this football. I decided on AI. I said, give me the 30 top NFL passers all time in yards. And some of the names on this list just like blew me away. And Tom Brady's number one. He's my all time favorite, being a Patriots fan. And some other players that were on this list that really surprised me, all great quarterbacks, but like number 30 was Matt Hasselbeck with over 36,000. Dave Craig from the Seattle Seahawks had over 38,000. Andy Dalton, still playing, has almost 40,000 yards. And when you look at these all-time lists of all these leagues and players, it's amazing like how some of these players, they haven't played in years, and you go, wow, they played great and they had all these yards. It's amazing. I love looking at stats of great players, but it's really something when you see like guys, like I said, Dave Craig, he's been out of the league, 25, 30 years, and he's one of the top 30 passers in NFL history. Isn't that cool?
Well, it is cool. And I think that one thing that happens is if you're into numbers and you're into stats, like I've always been, you grow up and you think, well, nobody's ever going to hit more than 714 home runs, what Babe Ruth hit. And yet then here comes Henry Aaron, with 755. And then here he comes. Now, again, you can might need the asterisk, but here comes Barry Bonds, right? But I mean, or the 60 home runs. Now that's been exceeded a few times. So I guess what I'm saying is you look at even what Tom Brady has done in the next 20, 30 years, will there be somebody else that comes along and breaks that record? I think that you can never say this is a record that won't be broken. There's some people that think that nobody's going to hit and break DiMaggio's 56-game hitting streak, but somebody probably will someday,
right?
If they play long enough. It's just, and the other thing too is you're always comparing, and that's kind of the fun thing. Is like you look at Shohei Ohtani, he's the first 50-50 guy. Well, now to me, it's even more remarkable when you think about the way the pitchers pitch today.
Mm-hmm.
That you have every pitching staff probably has 5 guys that can throw 90 plus miles an hour, and you go back 40 years ago, and you might be lucky to have one guy that can throw 90 miles an hour. So it's just very, very different. Batting averages are much, much lower now as a group. So I'm one who really follows the numbers, and I do kind of pull for some of the old school guys, and I don't like it when the records get broken. But on the other hand, I think that you have to admire the guys that are breaking them too, because they're just phenomenal. When you look at Shohei Ohtani, that guy, the things that he's doing are just, he's a unicorn.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know what? Wayne Gretzky's another one. I was looking at his stats the other day, and it's amazing what he did during his career. When he was 21 years old, he scored 92 goals. When he was 21 years old, he had 212 points. Just when you look back at those stats, some players have gotten close, but nobody's ever broken that record. Like you said, it may be broken, but 92 goals is just like on a different stratosphere. I don't know if you remember Wayne Gretzky, but he was just absolutely unbelievable.
Sure. And I think some of his records now, people are getting close. Is it
Ovechkin.
Alexander Ovechkin?
Yes.
He's getting close now in some of those. And again, at the time, you're thinking, oh, nobody will ever touch Gretzky in those records. But here we are, 30 years later or whatever, and people are getting there. And it's like, that's just the way it is in sports. And I think that that's what makes sports kind of fun too, is that, Barry Sanders is a great example of somebody, if he was just consumed with being the all-time rushing leader, he wouldn't have retired when he did from the Lions. So I think he just like, I'm done. I don't like the way things are going. I'm just going to bail. I'm out of here. I've had a good career. I'm healthy.
Yeah. Gretzky was just, when you look back at he wasn't the biggest player, but he had a stretch there in the early 80s with the Edmonton Oilers. There were guys like 12 guys on the team had double digits in goals. And the only reason why I looked at his stats is because Ovechkin, he's getting close to that record. And Mario Lemieux scored 87 goals. That's some astronomical numbers when you really think about it. Mario Lemieux, another great player, but I always like looking at stats like Larry Bird. Larry Bird played 13 years in the NBA. 13 years. You think he played more, and he only had a little over 23,000, 24,000 points, and he's still like one of the greatest players of all time. Isn't that amazing? Like the longevity of some careers are longer, but if you have a short career compacted like Larry Bird, look at those stats.
Or even Jackie Robinson.
Yeah.
I mean, didn't have the opportunity to play early on in his, career, even though he had the skills, but because of the color barrier and whatever, he couldn't play. So there's been a number of players who have not played as long. And then you look at LeBron now, and what has he played? 20 years now or something? It's just, he's had an incredibly long career. And so every time he scores a basket, he's just increasing the all-time points. And I think he's probably got the record now for the most triple doubles. So we're still living in a time where we're seeing just some incredible athletes in all the major sports. I mean, even now, even though the Brady just retired, you've still got Patrick Mahomes, who's doing wonderful things. You're seeing the running backs. The last few years, running backs they've kind of taken a back seat to a lot of the receivers and different things. They're not as important as they were. But then you look at what's going on in college football right now, and I think we might see a running back get the Heisman.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned LeBron James. He's played the most NBA playoff games in history, 287 games. So if you equate that, that's almost 4 seasons, extra seasons on top of the regular season. So he's played 24 seasons. If you like add the playoff game,
that wild?
That's just crazy. That's crazy.
It is crazy. And NBA, there is more of an opportunity to go to the playoffs. You look at a guy like Mike Trout. He's played, I think, 3 games in his entire career in the playoffs. And I think he only had a couple of hits. But yeah, there's been players like that because in baseball, especially if you go back to when we were kids, there weren't playoffs. There weren't like they have now. If you won the National League, you went to the World Series. And so that meant basically there were 2 teams that were going. And if your team didn't make it during your career, then you just never made it to the World Series. And that happened quite a bit.
Yeah, LeBron James, those 287 games, he's played probably more playoff games than players who played in their NBA career. That's another mind-blowing stat. I love looking at stats. And you look at players like Ken Griffey Jr., great stats. He could have had better stats if he didn't have some injury-plagued seasons. And then Ted Williams, he goes to fight in 5 years in 2 different wars, and he could have easily have been probably the top 1, 2, or 3 player of all time and hits, home runs. It's just mind blowing. Let's go back to Hawaii, because Hawaii is quite the scene. Like I said earlier in the episode here, some of those scenes from the ocean and the beach looking up at the mountains, they were just majestic and peaceful. What's it like? I've seen Hawaii through the eyes of Hawaii Five-0 50 years ago and recently on the show, but it's always nice. It always looks nice and warm and everything like that. So what's it like when you go there to live and then come back to the mainland? What's that like? Is there an adjustment?
Well, there is an adjustment because, first of all, I try to explain to people that the culture there is huge. I love the Aloha spirit. That's one of the things that had drawn me to return again and again and eventually move to Hawaii, is just the spirit of the Hawaiian people. But also when you talk about the beauty, and it's so diverse because you have the big island of Hawaii. Now, to give the idea, it's called Hawaii Island. Everybody calls it the big island, but you could take all the other islands and fit them all onto that island. That's how big it is. And I don't know if there's 11 or 12, what they call them, biospheres or whatever they are on our planet, but there's like 9 of them on that one island. And it's because you have the sea level all the way up to 12,000 plus with Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa, those volcanic mountains. So you can actually ski or snowboard and go right on down and get in the ocean. So you can do it on the same day. And some people do that. Wow. So it is very interesting. On Maui, there's a mountain called Haleakala, which is House of the Sun. And a lot of people like to go and watch the sunrise there. Mm-hmm. And at the top of the crater, there's 3, I would call them Forest Service cabins that you can rent, and they're spread out. And we rented one called the Paliku cabin, and we had to hike almost 10 miles to get to it across lava fields and different things. And we were just beat to death by the time we got there. And then we had to hike out the next day. That's one of the hardest things I've ever done. That was in 2014. Whoa. But talk about just, if you were up there and I showed you a picture, you would think I was walking on the moon or on Mars or something. Wow. It just doesn't even look like you're on Earth. It's just so desolate, and it's just all crushed volcanic rock in different areas. And so again, that's probably at about 9,000 elevation where where you're up there where those cabins are. But yeah. And so just, there's a lot of forests. You have species of animals and birds that are unique to Hawaii. They're nowhere else in the world. it's just, I mean, if you think about how far away it is, it's like over 2,000 miles from the West Coast. So it's just isolated out there in the middle of the ocean. And you can see why different governments wanted it. They wanted to have a military base there because it's just such a big spot. In 1940s, when Pearl Harbor was there, it was important to have that because then you could launch things from there rather than try and do it all from like the West Coast or something. So sometimes you'll get into discussions with people that are from Hawaii and they'll be like, well, our island, our people were taken over. It wasn't amicable. We didn't want this to happen. And I said, you know what? If America didn't do it, Russia would have done it. There would have been another country that would have done it. And that's for sure, because there is no way that they could have defended themselves against somebody else. So if somebody had to take it over, I think that having America do it was probably the better choice.
If you had to give like somebody that was going on vacation to Hawaii, would be like probably the top 1 or 2 places to hit that you must see or must do when you go to Hawaii?
Well, and I get these calls and people email me quite a bit about this, as you can imagine. So the first thing I say is, what island are you going to? And if they say they're going to Oahu, then I will tell them, you want to make sure you go to Pearl Harbor. And then I say, get yourself away from Honolulu, get out to the other parts of the island. So go to the North Shore. Now, in the North Shore of Oahu, you have all the places you've probably heard of. You have Bonsai Pipeline, you have Waimea Bay, you have Sunset Beach. These are just incredible surf spots with huge waves in the winter. Now, in the summer, Waimea Bay is a bay, but wintertime, you can have 20-foot waves there. So it's just, and it's all so beautiful. And there's only one road that goes around the island of Oahu. It's the Kamehameha Highway, and 2 lanes. And so you're out there in what they call the country, but it is just beautiful. And there's a lot of historic things there that you've heard about. That's on Oahu. If somebody says they're going to Maui, then, and also, do they want to go to nice restaurants? What is the purpose of this? Is it a honeymoon? Is it a family vacation? So there's lots of different things that kind of come into play, and depending on what their answers are, then I'll kind of steer them in a certain direction. But, do they want to see music and musical artists? Do they want to go to a luau? So there's so many different things, but yeah, there is a ton of stuff to do. That is for sure.
I remember watching the Hula Bowl on Christmas Day out there, the Blue-Gray game, if I'm not mistaken, back in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s, the Hula Bowl with all the college all-stars. And the Hula Bowl, was that the all-stars, or was that the teams? They have a bowl game out there is that the Hula Bowl?
Yeah, they had the Hula Bowl, and then they used to have the Pro Bowl out there too, kind of like the all-star game for the NFL players. But the stadium that they did all that in, Aloha Stadium, was getting old, and they're putting a lot of money into retrofitting it and fixing it up. And I'm not even sure where they're at in that process right now, but the Pro Bowl kind of went away, and they still will have a bowl game usually in Hawaii, the Aloha Bowl or whatever. They'll have one of those bowl games there. So I just don't know if they've been doing much in the last couple of years, just because they're already doing and working on the stadium.
Mm-hmm. So talk about your podcast one more time, Larry. You've had it for a number of years. Talk about your podcast, Nobody Knows Your Story, because it's a great one.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's just been a lot of fun. I do it because I enjoyed people. It's an opportunity for me to just sit down one-on-one with someone like yourself and just hear their life story. And almost every time I do that, I find similarities in their story and in my story. And because we're all people, and we have things that maybe we're different religions, maybe have a different cultural background, or from different, I've interviewed people from Australia and England, and I can't even tell you all the different countries from people that I've talked to. But at the end of the day, they love their families, they love their countries, they love music, they like to travel. So, I mean, you just find that even though this world is big, in many ways, it's not so big, and we have a lot in common. And so, yeah, I just really enjoy hearing people's stories and then sharing those with other people, because there's a lot of other people that are like me. They just like hearing stories.
Yeah, that's what I love about your podcast, because you listen to people, just everyday people, and everybody goes through the same joys and struggles and things of that. And I truly enjoy it. And you may pick up a thing or two as well, maybe a new way to look at things. So,
oh yeah.
So Larry Kemp has been my guest on my 100th episode, and I cannot thank Larry enough for coming on. I know he's busy. We're all busy, but Larry, I'm truly honored that you came on my podcast, and I really enjoyed talking to you, and maybe we could hook up in 2025 sometime again.
Appreciate it, Rob. Thanks again for having me on. Fun visiting, just like last time. And yeah, hey, and congratulations on the 100 episodes. You are in rarefied air. I'm telling you that right now, because I can't remember if it was you I was talking to, but
yeah,
the average podcast goes like 7 episodes or 5 episodes or something like that. It's not that many. People, they start them and they're all gun ho and then they just burn out real quick.
Yep. Keep grinding. All right, Larry, thank you so much. I know you've got a tight schedule, so I appreciate you coming on. Okay. You have a great Christmas. Thank you so much.
You got it. Thanks, Rob.
All right. Peace. Thank you.